Criminal profiling, psychological profiling, criminal investigative analysis or investigative psychology are terms used in identifying major behavioral and personality characteristics that influence the crimes criminals commit. Criminal profiling has long been used by law enforcement in solving crime. Particularly, profiling allows law enforcement to reduce the field of investigation by identifying a person who is most likely to commit or to have committed a crime. This field is reduced to the point of focusing on individual behaviors and personalities. Appropriate profiling is fundamental in projecting criminal behavior, thereby allowing law enforcement to be proactive as opposed to reactive when dealing with crime, as well as society when identifying crime. The overinterest in one type of violent crime, that is sexual violence, by societies, law enforcement, and criminal justice systems, has been very costly to say the least. Effective criminal profiling should embrace equality in its totality, especially when including the gender of the victim, as we will see later on, otherwise we will have a problem. Before we go any further, it is worth noting men are more likely to perpetrate and be victims of violent crime. Over 80% of violent crimes are perpetrated by men according to the 2020 Crime Survey for England and Wales. This is important owing to the common argument against men talking about being victims of violent crime because the perpetrators are men. We will discuss why talking about violent crime against men is important, especially for women, in a little bit, but before then, if men should not talk about being victims of violent crime because the perpetrators are men, then neither should women talk about slut-shaming because it is perpetrated, in part, mostly, or entirely, by high-status women who seek to assert a class advantage over their peers. High-status women employ slut discourse to assert class advantage, defining themselves as classy rather than trashy, while low-status women express class resentment, deriding rich, bitchy sluts for their exclusivity. Slut discourse enables, rather than constrains, sexual experimentation for the high-status women whose definitions prevail in the dominant social scene. This is a form of sexual privilege. That being said, here we go. We start with Europe, then we move to America. According to the 2020 Crime Survey for England and Wales, men are more likely than women to be victims of violent crime, that is, 2% compared to 1.3% of women. The susceptibility to violent crime holds true for all types of crimes except domestic abuse, where it is 0.3% of women and 0.1% of men. Estimates of domestic abuse showing that 8.1% of women and 4% of men are victims are from the self-completion module of the survey. Victimization by a stranger shows the greatest differentiation by gender, that is 1.2% for men and 0.4% for women. 36% of stranger violence involves more than one perpetrator, compared to 27% of acquaintance violence. 0.5% of men and 0.7% of women report experiencing violence perpetrated by an acquaintance. The incidence of stranger violence fell by 52% from 1995. While the incidence of acquaintance violence fell by 75% in 1995. 60% of violence victims are male, implying that 40% are female, with the numbers being reversed in instances where violence victims did not report any injuries, that is, 60% of violence victims without injuries are female. 73% of homicide victims are male. Male susceptibility to violent crime holds true even for children, with 3.6% of boys aged 10 to 15 years reporting being victims, compared to 1.4% of girls. According to the Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics, CBS, 2.5% of men and 1.7% of women report being victims of violent crime. Intimidation is the most common form of violence reported by 1.6% of men and 1.1% of women. 0.9% of men and 0.5% of women are victims of assault, with more women reporting sexual violence, which is the only form of violent crime where women outnumber men, if this graph is anything to go by. Half of all violent crime against women is committed by people known to them, while only 38% of male victims of violent crime know the perpetrators. According to this graph, half of all violent crimes against men are committed on the streets, with this number being 43% for female victims. 21% of female victims report being assaulted in their homes, with this number being 11% for men. Men are twice as likely as women to be victims of violent crime in hospitality establishments. According to this 1994 report by the American Department of Justice, which is the most common in all the searches, we don't understand why they haven't released subsequent ones like they do with the overall criminal victimizations, such as these ones that we will get back to briefly. 6.6 million men and 5 million women were victims of violent crime in 1994, that is, for every 2 female victims of violent crime, there were 3 male victims. Females were more likely to be victimized by someone they knew at 62%, while males were more likely to be victimized by a stranger at 63%. 31% of female homicide victims are known to their perpetrators, with this number being 4% for male victims. 4 in 5 victims of intimate violence are women. Separated women are 1.5 times more likely to be victims of violent victimizations compared to divorced men and women. When a violent act is perpetrated by multiple people, men and women were more likely to be victimized by strangers at 79% and 65% respectively. This table could paint a clearer picture of victimization by a stranger as opposed to by an acquaintance, which shows that men are more likely to be victimized by a stranger. Offenders are armed for 34% of violent crimes against male victims, compared to 24% of female victims. In assaults, but not robberies, females were more likely to sustain an injury, with male victims being more likely to be seriously hurt in instances where crimes led to injuries. Females are more likely to be victimized in their home than anywhere else, while males are more likely to be victimized in public spaces, such as open areas, parking lots, and business centers. Should have started with this table, but well, we are here now. Check out the differences in homicide rates. How about non-fatal victimizations? And the robberies? Aggravated assault and simple assaults? Men are overrepresented in all forms of violent crimes, except for rape or sexual assault. For those who understand numbers better with graphs, here we go, my friends. And these are trends from 1973 to 1994. Check out these latest trends on criminal victimization by overall numbers, paying careful attention to what is mostly reported than the other. The rates of rape or sexual assaults are almost close to those of robberies, for all those years from 2015, but they are nowhere close to assault, again for the same duration. All these statistics bearing in mind that according to the report, females are more likely than males to report robberies and simple assault to law enforcement. So if men and women would report these violent crimes at similar rates, we would have completely different numbers. The Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics reports that females are more likely to be victims of simple assaults, the ones that do not result in injuries, while males are 3 times likely to be victims of aggravated assault, the ones that result in serious injuries, with men being twice as likely as women to report injuries from assault. Men are also more likely to be victims of violent crimes involving weapons. Particularly, the assault of male victims is almost twice as likely as the assault of female victims to contain a weapon and cause bodily harm. Female victims of physical assaults are more likely to have known the perpetrator as a former partner, while male victims are more likely to be physically assaulted by a stranger. 1/3 of female victims, compared to 7% of male victims, are assaulted by a former partner, with this number being 22% and 5% respectively for current partners. 32% of male victims are assaulted by a stranger and 29% by someone outside the family, such as an acquaintance. 3/4 of physical assaults against women and 42% of assaults against men occur within a residential setting. 29% of male victims, compared to 13% of female victims, are assaulted in public spaces, such as parking lots, bus shelters, and the streets. Females are 10 times more likely than males to report being victims of sexual violence. Males account for the greater percentage of homicide victims at 74%. With more than 1/3 of male victims being killed by a firearm compared to 1/5 of female victims. Particularly, 84% of male homicides and 72% of female homicides involve weapons. 38% of male victims and 20% of female are killed using a weapon. Female victims are 3 times more likely to be killed by explosives, a car, or a poisoning device. Females being more likely to be killed using physical force and men being 8 times more likely to be killed by a gang is honestly confusing to me. Female homicide victims are more likely to be killed out of anger, frustration, and despair, as well as 4 times more likely to be killed out of jealousy or sexual violence. Drug or gang-related violence accounts for 20% of male compared to 3% of female homicides, with male victims being twice as likely as female victims to be killed out of revenge. 38% of female homicides and 4% of male homicides are attributed to a former spouse, with 28% of female victims being killed by a current partner compared to 3% of male victims. Females account for 3/4 of spousal homicide victims. Overall, females are more likely to be killed by a spouse, while 40% of male homicide victims are killed by a friend compared to 18% of females who are killed by a friend. 5% of female victims and 15% of male victims are killed by a stranger. Men are twice as likely as women to be victims of robberies at 65% of all victims, while women are more likely to suffer criminal harassment, whatever that means, at 73% of all related reported crimes. 81% of victimizations against women and 79% against men reported male perpetrators. Just to take you back a bit, I'm sure the statistics surrounding female homicide victims being more likely to be killed by an intimate partner are not exactly new to you, especially considering the whole social construction of domestic violence, but I might have come across some information that could be new to you. Different studies present varied statistics on rates at which husbands kill wives, and vice versa. For instance, one study concluded that 41% of female homicide victims were killed by their husbands, compared to 11% of male victims. Another study found that 62% of female homicide victims were murdered by their husbands, compared to 14% of male victims who were murdered by their wives. These figures, plus those picked from the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics, misrepresent the whole homicide picture since they are based on all homicide cases, and men are more likely to be killed by a stranger and an acquaintance than women are, so the perpetrators of male homicide are quite diverse. If the percentages are taken for only individuals who are involved romantically or married, the ratio is about 50-50 or splits in half, with wives being as likely as husbands to kill their spouse. It is worth noting that the escalation of altercation into murder depends on the involvement of weapons, especially guns and knives, and female partners, because of their physical disadvantage, are more likely to use weapons, including in self-defense. The female physical disadvantage, combined with the fact that male homicide is more likely to involve the weapon, presents quite the situation. The mode of executing a homicide, as we have seen, is of special interest. Husbands, because of the physical advantage, are more likely to be violent, which includes severe beating, cutting, stabbing, and shooting, all of which are easy to trace back to the perpetrator. Apart from using weapons, wives' physical disadvantage leads to the choice of alternatives, including poisoning and hiring hitmen. When a husband is poisoned, and they die, say of something like a heart attack or stroke, the death is attributed to natural causes even if the victim did not have a history of illness, since postmortems or autopsies are rarely conducted on the body in such instances. Cases of food poisonings are rarely traced back to the wife, since people generally get their food from different places. Even when a hitman and the quote-unquote employer are arrested, the homicide is not categorized as wife killing husband, but as death by a third party or by a stranger. So, spousal homicide offers a very interesting area of research, but people are so fixated on other things, so we'll look at it sometime in the future. Now let us profile rapists. 85% of rapists have had previous criminal convictions. Rapists who steal from their victims are more likely to have had previous burglary, drug, theft and robbery convictions. Rapists who take fingerprint precautions are 4 times more likely to have had previous burglary convictions compared to other rapists. Sexual violence perpetrators who break into the home of the victims are more likely to have had previous convictions on theft and burglary, as well as prison experience, compared to those who did not break in. Extremely violent rapists are over 3 times more likely to have prior convictions relating to violence. According to this report by the American Department of Justice, 86% of the 90 rapists chosen from 2,456 rapists had a prior adult criminal history. 31% had a prior rape conviction and 53% had a history of violent crime. Now to some statistics outside the scope of this video but important to the discussion in general. 73% of rapists are strangers to the victims, while 76% of the chosen respondents denied the crime on the grounds of being intoxicated or having obtained consent from the victim. Overall, profiling the 1978 rapists suggests that rapists are typical felons who commit rape in certain circumstances, while they commit felonies in others. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Nation Network, or RAIN, the largest American non-profit anti-sexual assault organization, 8 out of 10 perpetrators of sexual violence are people known to the victim, from former spouses to family members, which implies that 20% of sexual violence is perpetrated by a stranger. Some quote-unquote useless statistics in the context of this video, but still important in the whole discussion surrounding sexual violence. 60% of sexual violence in jail or prison, male-dominated of course, is perpetrated by the institution's staff members. 57% of sexual violence perpetrators are white, 27% are black, 8% of perpetrators are from an unknown ethnicity, 6% from other ethnicity, and 1% is a mixed group. Now we examine rapists' criminal histories. 370 out of every 1,000 suspected sexual violence perpetrators have at least one prior felony conviction, with 100 of these having more than 5 convictions. 120 of 1,000 of suspected rapists, 140 robbers, and 110 batterers have at least one prior conviction. 190 suspected rapists, 170 robbers, and 210 batterers have 2 to 4 prior convictions. 80 suspected rapists and 100 robbers and batterers have 10 or more previous convictions, indicating that perpetrators of crimes in which more victims are male have richer criminal histories. 520 of 1,000 suspected perpetrators of sexual violence are released awaiting trial, mostly after posting bail. 70 of 1,000 sexual violence perpetrators are arrested for another crime pending the hearing of their sexual violence case. Let's focus on the suspects who are released awaiting trial. 520 of 1,000 suspected rapists, 440 suspected robbers, and 630 suspected batterers are released awaiting trial. 70 of 1,000 suspected rapists, 110 robbers, and 90 batterers are arrested for another crime pending the hearing for the crimes they were initially arrested for. Bear in mind the fact that apart from sexual violence, men are more likely to be victims of all the other forms of violent crime. Notice that suspected rapists have the least likelihood of reoffending while they await trial. To top it all off, majority of released sexual violence criminals are arrested for a different crime within 3 years of being released, that is, 60% after 5 years, 56% after 4 years, and 51% after 3 years. From the statistics presented and analyzed in this video, assuming you are watching this on YouTube, if you're not then there is a link in the description, we learn a couple of things. First, except for sexual violence, men are more likely to be victims of all other forms of violent crime, that is, homicide, robberies, battery or assault, and aggravated assault. This is not common information because of the overfocus on sexual violence as the only type of violent crime for reasons we're all aware of, and subsequently presenting it as the worst thing that could ever happen to a human being, even worse than murder. Second, contrary to popular feminist claims that anyone can be a rapist, which has largely been pushed by Marilyn French's claim that all men are rapists, we have seen that over 80% of rapists are already criminals, so it is not just any person. Claiming that all men are rapists while ignoring their rich criminal histories presented by the perpetrators of sexual violence just advances the war on men. Let's not even start with women almost never asking for consent as they are socially conditioned to believe that consent is for them to give and for men to ask, with this conditioning being based on the stereotypical presentation of women as sexually passive and men as active, as well as the presentation of coitus as something men do to women as opposed to something men do with women. Purely focusing on heterosexual relationships. Third, the claim that men would never understand the fear women have of walking on the streets, in parking lots, and at night because they will never experience that fear is founded on everything else but facts or statistics, including emotions. As you are aware, we live in societies where being offended is a prerequisite to being right. Again, based on the statistics provided in this video, men should be more afraid of walking on the streets, parking lots, and at night. This is supported by the fact that men are more susceptible to violent crime by a stranger, with women being more likely, than men, to know the perpetrators of the violent crimes they are victims of. Also, women are more likely to be attacked in their homes and private places, whereas men are more likely to be attacked in public spaces, including streets, parking lots, and business parks. So then, it would make more sense for women to be afraid of staying indoors, because that's where they're most likely to be victims of violent crime. Out of curiosity, with men being more likely to be victims of all forms of violent crimes, except sexual victimization, by a stranger, most of which occur in public spaces, why aren't men afraid of walking out, even at night? Well, this could be associated with the male protector role which requires men not to show any fear. Also, men's physical characteristics puts them in a better position to protect themselves. While male physical characteristics are often presented as a source of male privilege in ignoring the male victims of violent crime, men seeking to protect themselves makes them more likely than women to sustain serious injuries that could sometimes be fatal. with female victims being more likely to sustain minor injuries as presented by the statistics in this video. There is also the fact that there's no hysteria surrounding male victims of violence, compared to the hysteria around sexual violence. Therefore, the fear women claim to have when walking in the streets, in parking lots, and at night is thanks to their social conditioning, especially by feminists and mainstream media, as opposed to actual facts, as presented in the video. So why is it important for everyone, even women, to be more concerned about male victims of violent crime than they are now? Well, wouldn't it be fair if sisters, mothers, wives, and daughters cared as much for their brothers, fathers, husbands, and sons as they expect them to care? You know, actually live up to men and women genuinely being allies as opposed to men being allies only when women are victims? Shouldn't a sister have a problem when their brother is assaulted on the streets? Shouldn't a wife have a serious problem when their husband is robbed on the streets? Shouldn't a mother have a problem when their son is murdered? Or should all these relatives focus on the fact that their loved one was victimized by someone of their own gender? Besides, as we have established, men are more susceptible to all forms of violent crime except sexual violence. Over 80% of rapists have a criminal history, and over half of rapists have a history of violent crime. Now, if sisters, mothers, wives, and daughters cared about brothers, fathers, husbands, and sons as much as they expect to be cared for, serious sanctions against violent crime perpetrators would be imposed before they got to be perpetrators of sexual violence. Thus, there is a possibility that if sisters, mothers, wives, and daughters cared about brothers, fathers, husbands, and sons half as much as they expected to be cared for in the name of being allies, then the rates of sexual violence could be reduced by half because perpetrators would be sanctioned heavily when they perpetrated all other forms of violent crime before they got to sexual violence.